Hey guys, Sniz here, and in this video we're going to do an overview of the Cast on Crit Ice Nova Frostbolt Cyclone Inquisitor that I've been playing in Ultimatum League. So first of all, we're going to talk about some of the Cast on Crit mechanics, why we chose Inquisitor, and why we chose the skills that we have chosen. Then we're going to go over the 6x budget version, the one showcased in the footage at the start of this video, and it's the one that I'm playing currently in Ultimatum League. And then we're also going to talk about a bit of a more min-maxed version, one where you use Awaken Gems and Cluster Jewels to get about 4 times the DPS of the budget version. So if you want to skip around, timestamps as always are in the description. But yeah, let's get into the build. Real quick, before we get into the guide, if you're enjoying this style of guide or just my content in general, you can always think about subscribing so you don't miss any of my uploads. And I'll also be streaming a BPL 4 over on Twitch this weekend, so if you want to give that a follow, link in the description. So, as many of you know, we usually do Cast on Crit builds on Assassin. So why do we pick Inquisitor in this setup? Well, after the mini Inquisitor rework happening in, I think it was patch 3.13, Inquisitor became a really good pick for Cast on Crit builds. The Righteous Providence Inquisitor Ascendancy node gives us critical strike chance depending on which one of our stats is the lowest between Strength and Int. That means if we stack a ton of Strength and Intelligence, we gain a bunch of critical strike chance, which is really good for Cast on Crit builds. Now, the Inevitable Judgment Ascendancy node following a Righteous Providence allows our critical strikes to ignore elemental resistances, so these two nodes synergize extremely well with Cast on Crit builds. Now, since we're already stacking large amounts of Strength and Int for crit chance, we end up having a very nice flat chunk of extra life and extra energy shield. But usually hybrid builds can be a little bit difficult to sustain, but thanks to the Inquisitor Ascendancy nodes, Sanctuary and Pious Path, our life regen now applies to our energy shield regen as well, which means that hybrid sustain is very nice on Inquisitor, and we also end up being ailment immune. Another advantage of playing as an Inquisitor is that we start at the Templar start on the passive tree, allowing us to pick up a few very nice block nodes as well as glancing blows. Now this in synergy with the Lights of Lunara shield gives us a crazy amount of damage since we're so focused on critical strike chance. Increasing our critical strike multi is a more multiplier to our damage. Now, usually in Cast on Crit setups, you need the spell that you want to trigger linked to a Cast on Crit linked to the attack that you're using to trigger it. So, sockets and links become very scarce in Cast on Crit setups. The Cospriest Malice allows us to trigger a cold spell from the weapon itself without the spell needing to be linked into our main 6-link. So, for cold Cast on Crit builds, it's pretty much impossible to beat the Cospriest Malice as your weapon. Not only does it allow us to trigger another cold spell, but it also adds a large amount of flat cold damage to our spells, it gives us increased attack speed, and a very nice chunk of critical strike multiplier and critical strike chance against chilled enemies. Now, although this weapon does have a very large intelligence requirement, since we're already stacking intelligence in our build, this isn't an issue for us. Now, another question that I get asked quite frequently is why do we use the combo of Frostbolt and Ice Nova? Well, Frostbolt acts as a carrier for Ice Nova. Now, what does that mean? Well, Frostbolt cast on its own is a little cold projectile that flies out dealing damage, and Ice Nova is a nova of cold damage that triggers around you. But if you cast a Frostbolt and then cast Ice Nova, you can trigger the Ice Nova from the Frostbolt. So all in all, this turned out to be a really good Cast on Crit build that you can do on a budget of about 6 Exalted Orbs. It requires no Cluster Jewels or Watcher's Eyes. We end up having more than 9,000 effective HP whilst being ailment immune and also having 75% attack block chance with glancing blows. And we end up having about 2 million Shaper DPS on the budget version. As a little extra, in the notes section of the budget version of this build's POB, you can find a detailed list of every single item that I use in this build, as well as a Path of Exile trade search query that you can copy and paste directly into your browser to get the exact item that you need for this build. I don't know if I'll ever do something like this again, but hey, for this one, there you have it. So let's take a look at the passive tree. Now, for a quick overview, this is what the tree looks like. We're mainly focused on life, critical strike chance, spell damage, elemental damage, and then stacking strength and int as well, whilst also going for some of the block nodes. So we start off at the Templar start, moving out we grab life, spell crits, elemental damage and elemental resistances, life, Glancing Blows is very good for us, so we grab this one as well. And since we are going for block, this is just a nice little wheel to grab for some more block and elemental resistances. You don't need this if your gear is good enough, but I still recommend you take it. Then we take some AoE just because it makes our Ice Nova feel a little bit better to play. This isn't necessary, this is just a little extra. Then, like I said, we move up, grab more life. We grab these nodes for aura reservation since we do use quite a few auras. And we stack a few power charges, so we grab this power charge over here. We move up, we grab this power charge over here as well. And then if you're stacking power charges, this little section right here is very good for cost on crit builds, so we grab this as well. Then we move down here, we grab some life, this life cluster right here, this life cluster right here, critical strike multiplier over here. This is a very nice few nodes to take if you're going to go for a spell-based block build, so that's why we take these. We move down here for even more life and some critical strike chance. Now if we take a look at the jewels that we have, the first one that we have is a Frozen Trail. This allows our Frostbolt to cost 3 projectiles instead of 1. It just spreads out our damage, it makes clear feel a lot better, and you get one of these in the campaign, so it's not a big deal to get this one. Then for our Timeless Jewel, we have a Glorious Vanity, a Doriani Glorious Vanity. Now the important thing here is that you get one with the mod that says Sacrificed in the name of Doriani. The number doesn't matter. It gives us Corrupted Soul, which gives us a large portion of our life as extra energy shield, and like I said before, we are a hybrid build and Inquisitor does synergize really well with hybrid builds, so this is a really good keystone for our setup. Then we have a large Thread of Hope, a large ring Thread of Hope. This gives us some cold damage and cold damage leached as ES up here. It gives us a percentage increased int right here. Some more crit chance, resistances, and cold damage, some energy shield, and then also some strength. Now this one isn't as necessary to take, I'm just a little bit starved on dexterity, as you can see. That's why I have this one, but it's not a complete loss since it does still give us some strength. Now, traveling down from the Glancing Blows node to Constitution right here might seem like a bit of a waste of travel nodes. But this does give us a large portion of increased life, and since we are stacking strength, each one of these nodes does give us quite a bit of strength, which means it gives us some life as well as critical strike chance. So this isn't as wasted as it might seem, but if you still don't want to do this, you could just save up all these points, maybe spec it into some spell crit somewhere. This jewel socket right here, as you can see, mine currently is empty. This jewel socket you use to fix whatever you still need. If you need some resistances, get a jewel with resistances. If you need attributes, get a jewel with attributes. If you don't need anything, get a jewel with some critical strike multiplier. That should boost your damage by quite a bit. So before we get into the ascendancies, I just want to say that this build is like a finely tuned engine. You need a lot of pieces working together for the build to actually work. So I don't feel that there's necessarily a right order for you to get these ascendancies in, but you need all of them for the build to function as a cost on crit setup. So I started off with Righteous Providence, which gives us a very nice chunk of flat strength and intelligence, but also increases our critical strike chance per the lowest attribute that we have. So that's why we always want to keep our strength and int as high as possible, but as close to each other as possible as well. Then we grab Inevitable Judgment. Since we push very high critical strike chance and we're near 100% critical strike chance on attacks as well as our spells, we pretty much ignore elemental resistances from the enemies, so that's why we don't have curses that reduce elemental resistances, or we don't have any gear piece that says penetrates elemental resistances, because we just straight up ignore them. Then Sanctuary gives us Consecrated Ground, and it also increases the damage that enemies take when they are on Consecrated Ground. And then this node, Pious Path, is very big for us. It allows our life regen to also affect our energy shield, which is very nice since we're a hybrid setup, and it also makes us ailment immune. And it also allows the effect of Consecrated Ground on us to linger for 4 seconds. So I've pulled the version of the build that I'm playing up on PoB because I want to talk about trigger rates. Now, as you might have noticed, in my build I have this weird little thing right here where I take the 2 small travel nodes but not precision. So, the important thing in custom crit builds is that you have a trigger rate, and you want your effective trigger rate to stay under 6.06 in this specific setup. Later on in the more expensive version, we'll talk about how that affects the trigger rate. In this version, we want our effective trigger rate to stay under 6.06. Now, this is a combo between how accurate you are, how often you critical strike, and the amount of attacks per second that you have. So if I, for example, take this node, it increases my attack speed and my accuracy, but as you see, it lowers my trigger rate and it lowers my total DPS. So for peak DPS in a setup like this, you want to be as close to 6.06 as possible, but you don't want to exceed 6.06. So let's talk about the gear that I use. Now, as I said, our weapon is the Cospri's Malice. It's pretty much impossible to beat, it's just so good for cold spell cast on crit builds. Now, we use the Cospri's Malice. This enchant that gives us increased critical strike chance per 4 quality doesn't affect the build almost at all. I've inserted it into POB and it doesn't change the DPS at all. The main thing that you want to look out for on the Cosprey, in this specific setup, we don't want a Cosprey that goes over 13 attack speed. I've played around with it a little bit, I've tested it. It seems that 12 or below is the best place to be for attack speed on your Cospreys. But just to be 100% sure, you might need to import your build into POB to ensure that you still have the correct trigger rate for your specific setup. Then for our helmet, we have a Crown of the Inward Eye. I use this helmet so often. It's just such a good unique, and it's really good on hybrid builds since it gives us increased life and energy shield. And then this one just has the Hatred has reduced mana reservation enchant. They're cheap. I think they go for about 40C. Like I said, it's in the notes section of the budget POB. Then our unique shield, we have the Light of Lunaris. It gives us a nice bit of spell damage, cold damage to spells, critical strike chance for spells, a very large chunk of energy shield, block, and then even more crit multi since we do take glancing blows. Then for our amulet, we take an Astromantis. Now since we're stacking strength and int, it's really difficult to get a rare amulet that could beat an Astromantis in the amount of stats that it gives us. And since Astromantises are really cheap, I just recommend you grab an Astromantis. It's really good for this build. And we anoint utmost strength for more strength and increased strength. Then for our rings, we have a taming as our first ring. Now, unfortunately, we don't really benefit too much from the increased damage per ailment. We only apply 1 ailment to enemies, but this ring alone gives us about 40 all res and a ton of increased damage. Now, if you're struggling with resistances, you could use prismatic catalysts to quality up this ring for even more resistances. I haven't done it, but it's an option if you want to. And then if you do really want to push more damage from the ailments, you could use a cluster jewel that shocks enemies, but in this setup we don't use one. Then for our second ring, now this ring might look a little bit intimidating at first, but the only stats that we really want is some elemental resistances and the assassin mark on hits, preferably a level 12 assassin mark. Since we are crit based, more flat crit chance and crit multi is really nice to have. And then if you do have the open prefix, you could craft chanting skills have reduced mana cost, but that's also just an extra. I don't even use the aspect of the spider in this specific setup, it's just a ring that I had laying around. Then for our gloves, we use Shaper's Touch. Now I was lucky to corrupt this one for increased life, but you don't need the increased life corruption on these gloves. The main reason we use these gloves is because they give us a nice bit of energy shield, as well as giving us a ton of accuracy since we do have about 500 int. It also gives us a little bit of energy shield, and the rest of the stats, I mean, they're helpful, but they're not that important for this setup. We mainly want them because they give us a nice chunk of energy shield as well as accuracy. Then for our boots, as you can see, very basic rare boots with life, resistances, and in this case, crafted on move speed. Now, in the more expensive version of the build, we do talk about things like Tailwind, Elusive, Onslaught, and it's important that you take those things into consideration because they do affect your trigger rates. So in this basic version of the build, I'd recommend you stay away from things like that, but if you do want to be a little bit faster, we'll talk about that in the more expensive version of the build. Then, for our belts, just once again, a rare belt with life and a ton of resistances. This could be swapped out for a Stygian, and then, you know, you still want some life and resistances, but then you could use the dual socket for onslaught on kill, phasing on kill, your resistances, whatever utility you still need, you could use a Stygian for. Then for our chest piece, we have an attack crit chance chest piece. Now this is very important that you get an attack crit chance chest piece that has tier 1 attack crit chance, and as a little extra you want one with an open prefix so you can craft on gain a percentage of your maximum life as maximum energy shield. Like I said, in the notes section of the budget POB we do have search links for all of these items, so you can just copy and paste the link directly into your browser and see what you get. So if we take a look at the flasks that we used, first off we use an instant life flask with bleed removal, then we use an Ateri's Promise for a little bit of extra chaos damage from our cold damage, as well as some leech and chaos resistance. Then we have a consecrated ground flask that removes curses. Now why do we have a consecrated ground flask if we have consecrated ground while we're stationary? Well, that's exactly why, because if we move around and we cycle around, we lose the effects of consecrated ground. Now that would mean that we would have to stop every now and again to reset consecrated ground, but when we use this flask, we reset the effects of consecrated ground with the flask. For a more DPS orientated version, you could use a bottled faith that would skyrocket your DPS, but it's not really gonna fit in the budget version. Then for our fourth flask, we have a movement speed flask with increased movement speed as well. Now the main reason we have this double move speed flask is since we are an Inquisitor, since we don't have Tailwind or Elusive in this setup, we can be a little bit slow when we Cyclone. So that's why this flask gives us a sizable boost to movement speed and just makes mapping a lot more bearable. Then for our final flask slot, and this is very flexible, in this setup I run a Rumi's Concoction for some increased spell block. Now we don't really gain anything from the attack block since we're pretty much attack block capped thanks to glancing blows, but this does give us a nice bit of extra armor. But yeah, like I said, this slot is pretty flexible. You can do here what you want. I just decided to go with a Rumi's. Now let's take a look at the skill gems that we use. Now in our Cospreys, first of all, we have an Ice Nova and a Frostbolt linked to Power Charge on crit. So this is how we generate our power charges, and the Cospreys automatically triggers this setup for us. So these three, they need to be in your Cospreys Malice. The rest is pretty flexible. Then for our auras, we have a Discipline and a Hatred and a Herald of Ash linked to an Enlightened support. Then we also run a level 20 Precision. Getting a level 21 Precision would give me 100% hit chance, so that's a future upgrade, but that once again would affect my trigger rate, so I need to take a look at POB. Then I've recently inserted a Stone Golem since I had the open socket, but this guy keeps dying always, and since we have so much HP, it really doesn't feel like he does anything for us, so this you can see as an open socket to do with whatever you want. Then I have a level 20 Flame Dash linked to a level 1 Arcane Surge. This is just so every time we Flame Dash, we trigger Arcane Surge for a bit more spell damage and some mana regen. Then in our gloves, we have our Righteous Fire. We only use the Vol version of Righteous Fire on big single target fights at the end of a map for some more DPS. Linked to an increased duration support, linked to an anomalous steel skin. Now the difference between an anomalous version and the normal version is the amount of damage that the shield can absorb. Now as you can see, mine isn't even level 20, and you probably won't even notice the difference. So a normal steel skin would work just as fine. Then I just have a portal gem to portal in and out of maps really quick without requiring portal scrolls. Then in my offhand, I have a Blade Blast. It's not linked to anything. The only reason I have this Blade Blast is because Blade Blast unnerves enemies on hit, making them take more spell damage. So it's just like something you want to pop on a boss before the boss fight for a little bit extra DPS. Then we have a Vortex linked to Bone Chill, just increasing the amount of damage that enemies take from cold damage affected by the amount of chill effect that we have. So my mapping playstyle is I have Steel Skin on Q and left click and Vortex on E. You can decide what you want on your left click, and you just hold these down while you map for your Steel Skin to trigger on cooldown and your Vortexes to be placed whenever that's ready as well. Then in our main 6 link, we have our Ice Nova. Now preferably you'd want this to be a 21-20 Ice Nova. Boosting the level of Ice Nova does increase the amount of damage that it does quite significantly. Linked to a level 20 quality cost and crit support. Linked to a level 20 added cold damage support. linked to a Phantasmal Cyclone. Now, the only reason we go for Phantasmal is because it has the chance to avoid interrupts from stuns while using the skill. So this basically just helps us avoid being stunned only a little bit. It's only 20%. You probably won't even feel the difference, but Phantasmal Cyclone does help out with that. Normal Cyclone would do pretty much the exact same thing. Then we have a Hypothermia support. This is a level 21. I just dropped it as a level 21. It does more cold damage with hits and ailments against chilled enemies, and we pretty much always have enemies chilled with this setup if they're not frozen. And then we just link it to a level 20 Enlighten for more elemental damage, critical strike chance, and reduced mana cost of our skills. Now, as you can see, these are all pretty basic gems. In the following section, when we talk about the more expensive version, we'll talk about the awakened variants of this specific setup. So for our Pantheon, the major god, we take the soul of Brine King. Since they removed Cyclone's inherent stun immunity, being stunned is a little bit of an issue in ultimatums, and this just helps out with that. Since we are blocked cap as well, this synergizes really well with our build. The second upgrade for stun and block recovery should help out a little bit as well, but the final two upgrades don't really do anything for us since we are ailment immune pretty much always. And then for the minor god, I just have the Soul of Ralakesh. The main reason I have this minor god is for the modifier that says you cannot be blinded, which would decrease our accuracy. And since we're a cost and crit build, we need to hit every single one of our attacks for peak DPS. But like you see, mine isn't even upgraded. I think I'll start upgrading Pantheons when once you only have to do them once a league and not once per character. Then for bandits, in this version I killed all the bandits, but Alira wouldn't even be the worst bandit in this setup. All of the things that she gives us does synergize with this build, so it's up to you what you want to do. And then like we said previously, for the Anoint, we anoint Utmost Might. Now for those of you curious about the MTX that I'm using, this is just the Harvest Core pack, and for skill effects we have Celestial Ice Nova, Blue Cyclone, Illusionist Ice Nova, Black Hole Frostbolt, and Celestial Herald of Ice as well. Okay, so now that you guys have everything you need to replicate the 6x budget version, let's take a look at a more expensive version that's focused a little bit more on DPS. Now, but disclaimer before we get into it, a build like this, really the sky's the limit in terms of DPS. The amount of money that you have pretty much directly correlates in how much you can get out of this. So whilst this setup isn't cheap at all, it's definitely not ideal if you want to invest multiple mirrors. This is more of a setup to show someone who wants to invest more into this sort of build the right steps to take and the right upgrades to get. We end up having about 5 million DPS while still having close to 9,000 effective HP while still being block cap and ailment immune. So I think let's take a look at some of the changes that we made to the skill gems. So our gem links didn't really change all that much except from two big changes. The one being we moved precision to be reserved on our life. Now what this allows us to do, if we link the rest of our auras up with an Enlighten level 4, this means that we can now run an Aspect of the Spider. Aspect of the Spider just increases the amount of damage that nearby enemies take, and it reduces their move speed. So it's a DPS boost while also keeping us a little bit more safe. Then the next big change happened to our main 6 link. Now, all that happens here is that we now have a level 21, 23 Ice Nova linked to an Awakened Cost on Crit. Now, as you guys can see, Awakened Cost on Crit has inherent cooldown reduction rate for socketed spells. Now this means that we now have a new trigger rate since we have cooldown reduction, and this new trigger rate is 7.57, up from 6.04. So that affects some of our gearing choices and some of the passive tree choices that we'll see in a second. Apart from that, we just switch in Awakened gems where we can, and we level the rest of our gems to level 21 and get 20 quality. We didn't really change too many in terms of the items. Most of the uniques that we use still take up their slot. They're really difficult to replace with rares. So the first big change that we see is in our body armor. Now we prioritize a body armor that has stats that look something like this. Now usually in endgame builds people go for additional curse, spell crit, frenzy on hit body armors, but this is a little bit tricky in our setup. So applying an additional curse doesn't really do anything for us since we already ignore elemental resistances. Being able to apply another curse doesn't really do anything for us except if you want to maybe apply same chains or enfeeble, which doesn't really affect our DPS. And then having spell critical strike chance on our chest also doesn't do anything for us. Since we're already stacking critical strike chance so heavily, our spells pretty much always have 100% critical strike chance. So increased critical strike chance for spells in your chest is also a wasted stat. So what I recommend going for is a +1 level of socketed active skill gems from Warlord, and then still you still probably need the attack critical strike chance on chest piece, and then whatever else you can get is nice. A frenzy on hit chest piece isn't the worst thing ever, but you do need to take frenzy charges and the attack speed that they give you into consideration when calculating your new trigger rates. I tend to avoid frenzies on cast on crit builds, but if you do have a chest like that, just do the calculations and you should be fine. Then we swap out our consecrated ground flask for a bottled faith. It's just a massive DPS boost, and it's really difficult to get around something like this. And then for our boots, the boots, it's just the typical Tailwind, Elusive, Onslaught boots. Now, one thing to note here is that I only have elevated Elusive on these pair of boots. I don't have elevated Tailwind or elevated Onslaught. If you have elevated Tailwind, you do need to take that into consideration as well when calculating your new trigger rate, or at least checking your trigger rate to ensure that you're still under the trigger rate. And also in configuration, I don't tick that we have Onslaught, because Onslaught usually gets triggered by having killed enemies recently, and in longer boss fights you tend to not, have Onslaught up against single target. So Onslaught isn't too important to take into consideration when calculating your trigger rates, but Tailwind is definitely important. Okay, so if we take a look at the passive tree, as you can see, we've dropped these few nodes down here, traveling over to Constitution to instead focus on using cluster jewels. Now this is a level 95 tree, and as you can see, we start off with a cold damage large cluster jewel with Cold to the Core, Prismatic Heart, and Doriani's Lesson. Now these two aren't as important. The main one you want to try and get is Cold to the Core. The increased cold damage per 25 of each stat is massive since we have so many stats, as you guys can see. So just getting a large with just Cold to the Core is going to boost DPS significantly, but getting a 3 passive does mean that you don't necessarily need to travel up here to grab Cold to the Core. Then for our mediums, we have Critical Strike Chance mediums with a Quick Getaway and Magnifier. Now since we have the Awakened cost on crit, we have a new trigger rate. That means we need to get sources of attack speed to hit our new trigger rate cap. And that's why we use Quick Getaway for some attack speed and critical strike chance. And the move speed also isn't bad. Then the second node, like I said, Magnifier for some AoE. AoE on this build feels amazing, and some critical strike multi. Both these mediums have Quick Getaway and Magnifier. Now, if you're getting annoyed with getting stunned and dying to stuns and ultimatums, you could switch these medium critical strike chance cluster jewels out for medium channeling cluster jewels, and then you could go for precise focus and unwavering focus, giving you a lot of crit multi if you've channeled for at least 1 second, and also making us completely stun immune in combination with Phantasmal Cyclone if you've at least channeled for a while. So that's one option that you have if you're getting sick of being stunned permanently. Then we also incorporate a Watcher's Eye. Now this Watcher's Eye it probably won't exist in League. I'm just showing you guys the 3 stats to prioritize on a Watcher's Eye. Now the first one is Energy Shield on hit while affected by Discipline. This is massive. Like, if you get this Watcher's Eye, I suspect you'll be able to tank Shaper Beams. The amounts of Energy Shield that we gain from just the little bit of ES on hit is crazy since we hit so often. And then the flat added cold damage while affected by Hatred is a big DPS boost. And then also the critical strike multiplier while affected by precision. So like I said, don't try to get a Watcher's Eye with all 3. 2 at most should already be extremely expensive in League. And then for our last jewel socket, here we just want to go for some critical strike multi. And it's also important that you use this socket right here to tweak your attack speed to get the peak trigger rate for your build. So keep in mind, we have a new trigger rate of 7.57. So you want to use this jewel to get as close as possible to your new trigger rate cap. The corruption for reduced mana reservation, as you can see, isn't as important. Yeah, and that's pretty much the only thing that really changes on the tree. And like I previously said, in the notes section up here of the budget POB, you can find a detailed list of every single item that you need with trade site links that you can just copy and paste to get the items that you need. And that's pretty much all you guys need to know to replicate something like this or to tweak it to your specific liking. Ever since they nerfed the whole self-curse playstyle, I've been looking for a decent mapper to go back to, and Cast on Crit is definitely exactly that. Although this version isn't as fast as the Assassin version, it definitely does have a lot of damage and a lot of tankiness for the amount of currency that it costs to get up and running. So I hope you guys have as much fun with it as I've been having with it the last few days. Like I said at the beginning of this video, if you enjoyed this style of guide and you want to see more like it, you can subscribe so you don't miss any of the uploads that I do. I am still working on some of the meme videos. They unfortunately just do take quite a bit longer to make, so keep an eye out for those as well in the near future. And then, like I've mentioned previously, I am partaking in BPL 4 over the weekend, so if you want to see some team versus team PoE action, you can always join the stream over on Twitch. It's going to be very fun. It's happening this weekend and I am in Team Chaos, so I hope to see you guys there. But anyway, that's it from me. My name is Sniz, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye. So for those of you wondering what BPL is, it's Badger's private league, and this is the 4th one happening. I'll leave a link to the video of him discussing everything in detail down below. It's going to happen this weekend. You get randomized into one of 3 teams, and then these teams compete against each other to see who can earn the most points and win at the end of the 4-day period.